Good morning. My name is Adam Stolberg, and I'm the Sam Nunn Professor and Chair at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs. And I want to welcome everyone to the latest event in the 2021 series of the Sam Nunn Bank of America Policy Forum. I want to begin our event today by thanking our co-host, which is the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, as well as our sponsors, Bank of America, and especially Wendy Stewart, Jill Toth, and Terry Block. As mentioned, this is the second installment of our 2021 program that features the challenges and opportunities for rethinking transatlantic partnership in light of the dynamic changes in great power politics that are before us. This discussion will be among several policy experts from the Carnegie Endowment, as well as scholars from the Nunn School, on key topics that are especially relevant today, but are likely to be with us in the future, ranging from emerging security and dependency issues in the Black Sea region to the evolving nuclear equation around Iran and high-tech challenges to transatlantic governance moving forward. And to tease out these critical issues, the discussion will be moderated by our friend Suzanne Kelly. Suzanne is the CEO and publisher of the Cipher Brief, who previously served as CNN's intelligence correspondent, as well as executive producer and news anchor of a morning program on international relations that was broadcast globally. She will introduce the speakers and moderate the ensuing discussion. However, before we turn the screen over to Suzanne to kick our discussion off, I would like to introduce someone who really needs no introduction, and that is former Senator Sam Nunn. As many of you know, Sam Nunn served as the U.S. Senator to the state of Georgia for 24 years. And in that capacity, he also served as chairman of the Armed Services Committee, the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigation, and on the Intelligence and Small Business Committees. He has championed many pieces of landmark legislation, including the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, as well as the Defense Reorganization Act. Since leaving the Senate, Senator Nunn founded and serves as co-chair of the Nuclear Threat Initiative and has been a distinguished professor of the practice in our school at Georgia Tech. Senator Nunn?
Thank you very much, Adam. And a few people to thank at the very beginning. We've got a lot to cover, a lot of important developments in the world in a very brief time this morning. But let me thank the Bank of America for not only this forum, but for the last 20 years, you've sponsored many forums here at Georgia Tech. And this has made a real impact, a big difference. So thanks to all who made that possible. And also want to thank at the very beginning Ambassador Bill Burns, formerly the head of Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, who has been interrupted in his partnership in this program by taking on the directorship of the CIA, an enormously important position. Interestingly enough, Bill wrote last year before the election, before he was named the head of the CIA, that, and let me quote him, "Europe is caught between an assertive China, a revisionist Russia, and an erratic America." So I'm wondering if he were here this morning, would he say we've changed any of those three equations? In any event, thanks particularly to Catherine Buchanan for taking over the special leadership that has been required to put this program together from the Carnegie Endowment's perspective. So thank you, Catherine. And also add thanks to Adam Stolberg and Chris McDermott, the Nunn School, and all who have participated in making this possible. And of course, the all-star panel, Phil Breedlove and Vicki Birchfield from the Nunn School, and Suzanne DiMaggio and Erik Brattberg from the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. And special thanks to Suzanne Kelly, who is one of our most influential, formerly CNN and now heading up the very respected and impactful Cyber Brief. And the folks at Georgia Tech brag about your publication all the time, Suzanne. So thank you for moderating this forum this morning. Lots of questions, and we won't have time to solve all these problems this morning, but I think it will be helpful to tee them up and get people around not just this country, but the world thinking about seriously the serious challenges we have. Let me pose a few questions that could at least help frame this debate. President Biden has emphasized rebuilding and strengthening alliances, beginning with the NATO alliances. We have, of course, economic challenges, we have technology challenges, we have strategic challenges in the nuclear and biological area, and we have military challenges and regional conflicts. So to the panelists this morning, certainly I would be interested in hearing how the U.S. returns to credible leadership of this enormously important partnership between the United States and Europe, particularly NATO. And the other question on that parallel, will Europe really be willing to lead even more than they have in the past, or to follow the lead? That's a big question. Second question, with fresh sanctions just having been announced in the last few days because of Russia's past actions, including interference with American elections, and with that combined with Russian troops mobilized on the border with Ukraine, which is, from my perspective, a very dangerous situation. What signals should the United States and our European partners try to send at this crucial stage to avoid confusion and to provide clarity and hopefully to prevent further conflict in that war-torn region? And how do we avoid confusing signals, which is enormously important at this time, as Ukraine is not formally part of alliance, but certainly NATO wants to prevent conflict in that region so important to Europe and the world. My third question is,
we might be having a few technical difficulties, Senator. Let me.
How do we keep China on? Fourth and five question. It's technology development. Very popular. Should we, or can we, some type of understanding and partnership with Europe in successfully dealing with China, with all of those agreements, conflicts, and challenges? Can we carve out existential interest, like Bible of mankind in terms of the nuclear challenges we face, so that we cooperate on some issues that are existential to our countries, to U.S. and Russia, also China, like nuclear challenges and dangers, like biological challenges and dangers, and like in the longer term climate change. So those are just a few questions, and if you answer them all, this will be a world record. But I do think we all have to think about these issues because they are enormously important. With that, Suzanne, over to you.
Senator, thank you. Can I get you, before you leave us, we had just a little bit of a technical challenge given this new world we're living in. Could you repeat just the third question for me quickly, sir? I was taking furious notes over here.
Well, I think the third question was how the U.S. and Europe basically cooperate in restoring some type of understanding to prevent the Iranians from developing nuclear weapons.
Yes. Yes, absolutely right. Sir, thank you so much. Senator Nunn, it's a pleasure to be a part of this program and part of what the Nunn School has pulled together with this amazing series. So on behalf of myself and the Cypher Brief, I'd just like to thank you for the opportunity to have these important conversations today. Before I introduce today's experts, I'd like to remind everyone that there is going to be a Q&A portion of this conversation. So start thinking about your questions early on. You can use the live chat feature that should be on the right-hand side of your screen. If you see that, go ahead and put your questions in at any time. We'll get to them a little bit toward the end of the conversation, but I know sometimes if you're like me, you have 100 questions pop into your head at once. So go ahead and submit those to us throughout the conversation today. And with that, let me introduce our experts on these topics this morning. I think the Senator did a fantastic job of laying out where we are in the world, what some of the issues and challenges are, and particularly the focus on allied relationships. So Vicki Birchfield is professor in the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech. She's also co-director of the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies and the director of the Study Abroad program on the European Union and Transatlantic Relations. She is the author of too many books for me to name here and joins us from outside the U.S. this morning. Vicki, welcome. Erik Brattberg is director of the Europe program and a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington. He is an expert on European politics and security and transatlantic relations. Hi, Erik. Welcome and thank you for being here. General Phil Breedlove is a retired four-star U.S. Air Force general who completed a 39-year military career. You don't look a day over 39 yourself, sir. He held 8 major commands across 4 continents during both peace and conflict and culminated his career as commander of U.S. European Command and NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe. So his perspective is particularly interesting on these issues when we talk about alliances. Suzanne DiMaggio, the other Suzanne on the panel this morning, is senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where she focuses on U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East and Asia, especially Iran and North Korea. So you can see we are teed up with a host of fantastic experts to give us some top-line briefings this morning on how we should be thinking about these issues, what the challenges are, and where they're going to be leading. And with that, General Breedlove, I'd like to start with you. We've been paying attention to what's been happening in the Black Sea region. It's an area you watched closely during your time as NATO's Supreme Allied Commander. Can you start us off this morning by giving us some insights into the challenges as you see them today?
Well, first of all, thank you to yourself, the organizers, our sponsors, and to Senator Nunn for having me here today. Yes, it seems in the last week or so especially that all eyes have turned to the Black Sea region. And so what I want to do is start in the easier end, possibly in the south, and then work our way to the sort of the hot spot in the north. Lots to say about a great ally in the south, Turkey, and the issues that we have seen between Turkey and the United States, and some of the issues we've seen between Turkey and NATO. And just to set the stage, I believe that Turkey is incredibly important to our alliances, as the new president has talked about reinstituting the importance of these alliances. And Turkey's geostrategic position alone makes it invaluable to NATO, but it as a military and it as an anchor in that part of the world is very important to our NATO alliance. And so my thought is that many want to write off Turkey, and we hear this talk about, is there a procedure for removing a country from NATO? And I think that's the wrong place to start. I would say rather, let's start with how do we re-embrace Turkey? How do we find our way back towards common values? And how do we work these technical issues that seem to be prying us apart? And I jokingly remind people that it's not so bad with Turkey yet. We in our history have been thrown out of a NATO country, and that hasn't happened here. And so we need to remember that it is important to work through these issues and find our way back together. In the middle part of the Black Sea region, some things to celebrate. Lots of good things going on. I'll just highlight Romania, a country that is working through reforms, a country that is finding its way into a great military that is responsive and recognizes civilian control, great leaders who are now bringing readiness to the country, and just a real sort of bright star in the south for others to look at and say, here's how we find our way to being a responsible ally in an alliance after coming from a history like our own. But if we cast our eyes a little to the east towards the Caspian era, area, we remember that it's just in the past month that we've had this conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, and Azerbaijan and the Azeris coming to pitched battle. Many losses, lots of damage inflicted to both militaries, but the Azeri army took a pretty good beating. The Armenian army took a pretty good beating. And what to think about there? First of all, the Azeris fought a very different style of warfare and have introduced this air power, drone power, linking kill chains, as we call it, or linking intelligence to targeting, and how that can decimate an army that has not grown into the future. How important air superiority is, and how it is to grow your warfare into the future. And so we need to think about that. But the thing geopolitically to worry about is now this Russian peacekeeping element that is on the ground. And what does that mean? And how long will it be there? Will this be another permanent enclave like Transnistria, or in some of the occupied lands of Georgia or occupied lands of Ukraine? And so a worry about how this will all sort out into the future. And then finally, on the Nagorno-Karabakh piece, the concern that we had three major powers, Russia, Turkey, Iran, all involved on different sides of a conflict. And can we always count on that resolving in a way that don't bring great powers into conflict, and how we should then cast towards not allowing these kinds of dust-ups to grow into something larger. And then for the last couple of minutes in my little bit of time, of course, all eyes have been on Ukraine. 5 days to a week ago, I was less concerned. We had about 28 battalion task groups on the border, very similar to the spring of 14 when I was the SACEUR and Russia first invaded Crimea, and then Russia invaded the Donbass. But across the last few days, those forces have grown. I was less concerned 5 days ago because we didn't see some of the more strategic assets, field hospitals, artillery, supply chains, and now we see all of these elements evident in the eastern Ukraine area. The Ukraine military believes there's as many as 80,000 on the border. I don't know that that number is right, but it certainly has increased from the 28 battalion task groups we saw in the not too distant past. So what is it that Mr. Putin is trying to do? Two scenarios are seen. The scenario of enlarging the Donbass enclave to put more pressure on the Zelensky government, which continues to lean to the West and has begun to fortify the line of contact. And then the other scenario is that Mr. Putin is preparing to take water rights for Crimea. As we all know, the freshwater supply to Crimea has been changed as a result of the war where Russia invaded and took over the Crimean Peninsula. And so the canals and things that bring water from the Dnieper River down to Crimea are something that Mr. Putin would like to be have in Russian control. And so there are a couple of options there. Whether Mr. Putin is continuing a coercive campaign, or whether Mr. Putin is actually preparing for further real kinetic warfare in Ukraine, I think if anybody tells you they know the answer, you should take it with a grain of salt. But what we do know now is in the last 4 or 5 days, things have changed. And Mr. Putin has brought to bear all of the pieces now that, should he decide to do kinetic warfare, he could. And then I will leave us with a challenge maybe for the questions. I'm going to offer my opinion. I'm not grading anyone's paper, but it is clear to me that the Minsk protocols and the Normandy format have failed Ukraine. We have not reestablished an inch of the Ukraine border back to Ukraine. Russia is still in control of the border and major portions of Ukrainian land. And so I think that we in the West, the larger West, and certainly we in America who are trying to re-embrace our responsibilities and alliances and in our European partners. We need to rethink and look at whether the Minsk and Normandy formats are appropriate to task. Are the right people at the table? And do we have a clear path ahead? I think I'll leave it at that, Suzanne. Thank you for the time.
General, thank you so much. I took a lot of notes on follow-up questions I have for you, because I think you laid down a fantastic sort of look at where we are right now, and what may be coming next. Suzanne DiMaggio, let's turn to you now to talk about challenges with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. You know, the U.S. and European leaders resumed talks just yesterday on the plan, as Iran's President Hassan Rouhani said earlier this week that Tehran will begin enriching uranium at 60% purity. I am certainly not a nuclear scientist, but I believe it's around 90% that's considered weapons grade. 60% is far more than allowed under that agreement. Where are we with this? And can you brief us on some of the current challenges as you see them today?
Mute myself. Thank you, Suzanne, and I'm really pleased to be part of this event. And as you mentioned, will focus my remarks primarily on U.S.-Europe relations and the JCPOA, as talks go on in Vienna right now. It's very timely. So just some brief background. Iran and the P5+1 reached a nuclear agreement, officially known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, in July 2014. The deal puts limitations on Tehran's nuclear program in return for sanctions relief. It was the result of years of painstaking diplomacy, including European-led efforts over the course of more than a decade, stretching back to 2003, as well as intense US-Iran diplomacy from 2012 to 2015. When President Trump withdrew the US from the deal in May 2018, he reimposed sanctions on Iran. I think it's fair to say that he and his administration were quite indifferent to this extensive European effort that went into bringing this nuclear deal to fruition. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that without Europeans' investment in diplomacy with Iran, there likely never would have been a deal. So European powers were directly engaging Tehran on their nuclear file, even when there was little American appetite for engagement. And the groundwork provided the foundation first for an interim agreement called the JPOA, and then the JCPOA. So it's very self-evident to say that transatlantic policy on Iran during the Trump era was plagued by sharp disagreements. The administration pursued a maximum pressure policy. The centerpiece was an extensive array of sanctions with very little room for serious diplomacy. And the results have been what many call a failure. As you mentioned, Iran has now expanded its nuclear activities. They announced today they started enriching at 60%, which is closer to weapons grade, but it still is easily reversible. And we've also seen tensions in the Middle East, including tit-for-tat military attacks, escalating, undermining both European and US interests on a range of fronts. This approach, maximum pressure approach, also led to serious humanitarian consequences in Iran, including blocking the provision of food, medicine, medical equipment, all during a pandemic. So the US's withdrawal from the deal and the enforcement of secondary sanctions has had a particularly negative effect on Washington's relationship with European allies. The administration essentially told our European partners that even though the JCPOA is an international agreement enshrined in a UN Security Council resolution, and even though Iran continues to fulfill its deal commitments, which it did for 1 year after we withdrew, we are not going to allow you to fulfill your commitments to it. A senior European official asked me at the time, why is the US strong-arming its closest allies to act against their own economic and security interests? So let's fast forward to today, the current state of play. We now see the Biden administration focused on reviving the JCPOA with an intention to build on it. So in this context, returning to the deal offers a way to help mend and strengthen the transatlantic alliance and realign our policy priorities. It's important because the Biden team has framed their foreign policy as proceeding on the basis of the renewal of America's ties with the world, particularly our allies. So the remaining signatories to the agreement are engaged in talks in Vienna as we speak. The good news is that both Iran and the US agree on the goal of reviving the JCPOA. But given the high degree of mistrust in the US-Iran relationship and the complexities involved, getting there will not be easy. US officials are in Vienna too, but the Iranians are refusing to meet them at this stage. So they're following a proximity talks model. And here the Europeans are playing a particularly important role, shuttling back and forth to facilitate direct communications, indirect communications, I should say, between the US and Iran. They're pursuing a comprehensive implementation approach. So 2 roadmaps are being developed to outline the measures and timing for the full return to compliance by Iran and the US. I think it's a very promising approach because the goal is to provide full clarity on the end game. It's a simultaneous process, which means neither side needs to make the first move. The parties have established 2 working groups. One is focused on the process for lifting sanctions by the US, and the other is focused on what steps Iran will take to bring its nuclear program back into compliance. There are 2 potential sticking points ahead that I think need to be managed very carefully. First, some Iranian officials, including Supreme Leader Khamenei, have said that the lifting of all US sanctions levied during the entire Trump administration must be verified before Iran will take a single step to come back into compliance. This is a maximalist position. I think if they adhere to this position, it's certain to lead to stalemate. And as we've seen over the last 24 hours, more recent statements by Iranian officials indicate some flexibility on this point. The second potential sticking point so far, the Biden administration has been vague about which sanctions and designations will be lifted, is the intention to return to January 2017 and reverse all of the sanctions, or only the nuclear JCPOA related sanctions. I think here, failure to take a more expansive view on sanctions relief will severely limit the economic benefits Iran could receive from complying with the deal, and that also could produce a stalemate. So resolving these issues, I don't see them as insurmountable, but they will require eventually, I think, direct diplomacy. In other words, we need to move from these indirect talks to direct engagement as soon as possible, and perhaps to get us over the finishing line. So looking ahead, I think there are clear reasons to quicken the pace. The talks in Vienna that are happening now were nearly derailed by an attack earlier this week at Iran's nuclear facility in Natanz. That's a uranium enrichment site under IAEA inspection. It's widely been attributed to Israel. The US has denied any involvement. So now in response, Tehran has reportedly attacked an Israeli ship. And as we've mentioned, it's informed the IAEA of its decision to increase the purity of its enriched uranium to 60%. And we see them now replacing the damaged centrifuges at Natanz with more advanced ones. So we have to ask, will the spoilers continue to try to undermine these talks? I think we should assume so. This is a dangerous escalatory cycle in play. It's been playing out for quite some time. So I think the longer it takes to reach an agreement to reconstitute the JCPOA, the likelihood of a derailment of the talks increases. And another reason to move swiftly is Iran's political calendar. There's a small window of opportunity to de-escalate tensions and revitalize diplomacy prior to Iran's presidential election in June. So just to conclude, it makes great sense for the US and the Europeans to work together on pursuing a strategic opening with Iran that begins with the reconstitution of the JCPOA. Of course, putting Iran's nuclear program back under tight constraints is a top priority we hold in common with the Europeans. Beyond this, reviving the deal could help clear a path to pursuing other objectives that we share, such as negotiating a longer and stronger follow-on deal to the JCPOA, also reaching a political settlement to end the war in Yemen, developing regional dialogue and support for the withdrawal of US and NATO troops from Afghanistan. In fact, a meeting co-convened by the UN, Qatar, and Turkey will be held in Istanbul on April 24th on this very subject, and my understanding is the Iranians will participate. Also setting the stage for a broader regional discussion to limit ballistic missiles, and engaging UN and others in seeking a long-term regional security structure involving JCC countries and Iran. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to questions.
Suzanne, thank you. I think one of my favorite desires to be a fly on the wall this week was when Benjamin Netanyahu made the announcement that Israel would never allow Iran to achieve a nuclear weapon or to develop a nuclear weapon after the lights went out at the Natanz facility on Sunday, and seeing that the U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was standing right there with him when he said it, which is just, I guess, the theatrics that come along when talks are happening anywhere in the world on issues like these. But it would have been great to have listened to the conversation between those two after that. Thank you so much for setting the stage for that. I have a number of questions for you as well. And let's turn, though, now to Vicki Birchfield, so we can talk a little bit about another really important emerging technology, which is artificial intelligence, when it comes to understanding how allies are going to gather information, sort through information, share information, and use AI to replace a lot of things that have been done for years by people. Vicki, welcome. It's so nice to see you here today and to talk about this issue as well, because particularly with the Five Eyes Alliance, I know that there's a lot of focus on how artificial intelligence is going to impact the future of collection and sharing of information. Of course, in the US, the National Commission on Artificial Intelligence just came out with some pretty interesting recommendations. Let me turn it over to you to give us a sense of where you think we are when it comes to artificial intelligence and allied relationships.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, and thank you to Senator Nunn, the Nunn School, and Carnegie for setting up this discussion. It's a real privilege to be here, and you queued me up nicely, so I can go right to the heart of the matter, and that is, why technology governance generally, I think, will be just very decisive in shaping the solidity and the future of the transatlantic relationship. And I'm going to focus specifically in on AI for the reasons you articulated, Suzanne. And I think that this is a focus on AI is important for two reasons. First is simply the nature of AI, as you said, and I'm referring to those enabling ubiquitous technologies that combine data, algorithmic decision-making, and computing power. All those systems that are rapidly diffusing across all sectors of society, not just information communication networks, social media platforms, but the finance sector, healthcare, transportation, energy, military applications, and so forth. And so I just wanted to encourage our audience to check the chat box where we've put a link to the recent Nunn School Symposium that dealt with these issues in a three-part series, of which Suzanne was had an excellent role in that. So I encourage you to check that out. And so I just wanted to mention a new publication by General John Allen and Darrell West, a book called Turning Point, where they argue that AI is the transformative technology of our times. And it will be impossible for us to address major questions about human safety, freedom, security, societal well-being without evaluating the way in which AI is implemented. And so that leads to the second reason why I assert that AI regulation will be critical to shaping the EU-US relationship, because the EU and its member states for the past several years have been engaging in precisely that exercise. They've been hard at work confronting those very questions related to the implications of AI for the whole of society. and for the international system. And they've done so, I want to underscore this, they've done so through a multi-stakeholder process of consultation with technologists, researchers, ethicists, business leaders, and policymakers, similar to the National Security Commission's work, which I'll come back to. But I really want to emphasize how different this is from a top-down, technocratic-led policy process. And this has really culminated in a series of strategy pronouncements, including the ethical guidelines for trustworthy AI in 2019, the white paper that was released last year, and the adoption of national AI strategies by its 27 member states. And finally, and most significantly, is the EU is set to release any day now, by the end of this month, a major piece of legislation for ensuring human-centric, ethical, secure, and accountable AI. And unlike what we've seen up to this point, this legislative framework will take the form of a regulation, which means it will be legally binding, thus holding the potential to wield influence globally, perhaps replicating the so-called Brussels effect of the likes of the GDPR, the EU's data protection regulation, which was implemented, as I'm sure you all know, in 2018, which set the international standards for global privacy rules and really led to a scramble. Some people say that the US was kind of caught flat-footed, and governments across the world really doing business in EU markets and with EU consumers had to scramble to comply with these new this new regulation. So I think it's important that we do take note that this new approach, the EU's approach to AI, will be distinct from the GDPR, of course. And importantly, it's a risk-based one, not a rights-based orientation. So they're very different kinds of legislation. But this risk-based approach is important, especially for those who are very quick to criticize or assume that all EU laws will involve regulatory overreach and be innovation stifling, et cetera, and very costly to comply with. So the EU has been very careful for the past several years, again, in bringing all of these technologists and AI developers themselves into the discussion. And so they've really, what we're going to see, I think, in this legislation is a very narrow and circumscribed approach where, again, it's risk-based and it will focus mostly on high-risk AI applications. And I think that's important to underscore. However, it is important to note that without data, there's no AI. So we shouldn't fool ourselves. The GDPR will go hand in hand with this new framework. And that's to ensure that the EU values and fundamental rights will be protected. And I think those rights and values should be and are the ones that we cherish on our side of the Atlantic as well. And I think that's important to underscore. Furthermore, this AI regulation needs to be understood as integral to a much larger digital strategy that the EU has been pursuing. And right now, the European Parliament is debating the Digital Services and the Digital Markets Act and their data governance strategy. So it's important to keep an eye on those. And all of this is part of a broad EU kind of reorientation of its industrial strategy. That does fit purpose not only for the digital transformation, but the green transformation, and to kind of harmonize those things, which again, I think the Biden administration shares those visions. And the EU is trying to, engage in, I think they have engaged in a reality check about this new geopolitical and, strategic 21st century international system we're facing. In contrast, I want to point out that on the U.S. side, there's been actually very little policy development. As Suzanne mentioned, the National Security Commission's report was just published, and in fact, I want to quote their opening line: "Americans have not yet grappled with just how profoundly the AI revolution will impact our economy, national security, and welfare. America is not prepared to defend or compete in the AI era," end quote. Now, I think that's a bit provocative and a little bit surprising, given how prevalent the global narrative is that the AI race is really one between two contestants, the US and China, and by most accounts, the US is still in the driver's seat, still maintaining this lead, despite the fact that China is nipping at our heels and actively pursuing AI dominance. Different metrics, different message perhaps, but the one consistency in these various discourses is that the EU is always lagging behind. And as my co-panelist Erik has put it, the EU is punching well below its weight when it comes to AI competitiveness. But he and his co-authors contend, and I've also put his Carnegie publication in the chat, which I think is a really excellent report as well. Should have put the National Security Commission one, but I'm sure Suzanne can do that. At any rate, he and his authors say that the EU's normative approach and regulatory approach will not be sufficient to make the EU a global AI leader. And so I want to underscore that the Commission has been positioning itself discursively and in these policy reforms to offer a third way, an alternative, if you will, to the US commercial tech-led approach to AI, soft regulation, and the state-led Chinese approach that, of course, exploits AI for social repression and social control. And so the EU, I think we need to focus a little bit on that because there is a window of opportunity to seize, and I think it's time is of the essence. The US needs to recognize that the EU is already leading, and in fact, their approach substantially shaped the OECD framework on ethical principles in AI, which over 40 countries have adopted. The EU helped get the AI agenda on the G20 meetings. And again, to kind of conclude, the U.S. National Security Commission, in its conclusion, urges the U.S. government to work with Europe to develop AI rules essential to security and economic prosperity in the face of a foe as powerful as China. So I would suggest that the groundwork laid and the leadership already demonstrated by the EU opens up an avenue to do just that. So the Biden administration should seize the moment of valorizing rather than undermining or working at cross purposes with the more assertive and capable EU, and should I say just aspiring strategically autonomous EU, to instead kind of divert their attention from this third way and get on board so that we can produce a joint AI agreement that would reaffirm and solidify our shared values. Thank you very much.
Vicki, I think you touched on so many important issues. One being that overall, what I take away from what your comments on this is that when it comes to AI, this is not something that the U.S. and its allies can afford to work on in silos, and that given the particular competition with China and how dominant AI issues are going to be, it's really important that these dialogues continue happening at a fast rate, if that's probably an understatement, given how quickly technology is moving forward. I think you really framed this up incredibly nicely for us. And then we'll have to come back at some point and talk about quantum, because that's also a game changer when it comes to the issue between the US and China, when you're talking about how both of these entities look at values-based approaches to AI, whether they do or they do not look at values-based approaches. All really good questions and great things for us to think about. And then again, if you have not read that Commission report, I do suggest that's a good place to go and do some early homework on briefing up on where we are today with AI that Vicki mentioned. Erik Brattberg, you've been so patient. And we're going to turn to you now to talk about another incredibly important issue, which is cyber aggression in China. And I think Vicki may have just teed it up perfectly for us to give you kind of a launching pad into where we are today with cyber aggression. You know, we've been talking for years. I remember 15 years ago, working at CNN and talking with people on the Hill about how, oh my gosh, it's so important on cyber. We need to get to a point where we can share information quickly between government and private sector, given that the private sector is such a huge target by China and Chinese hackers. Where are we today, and why can't we seem to get any progress on this faster?
Well, thank you, Suzanne. And I think this question really illustrates, I think, really well the fact that the Transatlantic Alliance, which used to be about conventional security issues, and to a large extent, as General Breedlove mentioned, still is, with sort of Russian aggression on the eastern flank and instability in Europe's neighborhood. But it is increasingly also about technology, both cyber, but also other technology challenges like Vicki mentioned, and the rise of China. So I would like to talk about both the technology piece and the China piece, and how really I think these two issues should serve the role of not just changing the transatlantic relationship, but really reinventing it for a new era, with these two challenges are really at the core of the challenge that NATO is facing. So starting with the technology piece, obviously, as our societies are becoming more digitally interconnected, we're also becoming more vulnerable. And in many ways, the challenge, as Vicki mentioned, is both from China's own digital authoritarian model, and it's sort of suppressing freedoms in China, but also increasingly exporting that to other countries as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And that constitutes a threat to democracy and to free markets. But we're also, of course, seeing China and Russia and other countries, authoritarian countries, waging cyber attacks and using various tools of technology to interfere and disrupt our democratically elected societies. So I think what we need is both a defensive strategy to protect ourselves, but also an affirmative, sort of positive strategy to make use of technology and ensure that it's something that benefits our societies. So starting with the defensive piece, I think NATO has already made a lot of progress on cybersecurity, on addressing hybrid warfare. Certainly, this will be a key piece of the upcoming 2030 report that the NATO Secretary General is convening, thinking about the alliance role on these issues. But I think there's also a lot of these digital and technology issues are topics that NATO as an alliance and as an organization is not necessarily particularly well positioned to do. As Vicki mentioned, this has to do with oftentimes regulations. It has to do with dealing with civil society and the private sector. And I think in this role, it's really the European Union and it's some of the member states that have some of the key tools that we need to work with. So I think what we need to do is make sure that the United States work at NATO, but also work with the European Union, work with European countries and others on things like setting standards for 5G and increasingly also 6G, working on reducing reliance on vulnerable supply chains stemming from China and elsewhere, investing in semiconductor capacity and so forth. So that's the sort of defensive piece. But at the same time, as I mentioned, I think we need also an affirmative piece here to make use of technology. And I think there's a limit to how much of that you can do at the multilateral level with countries like Russia and China. I really think what you need to do is have like-minded democracies work more closely together, not just in the North Atlantic between the US and Europe, but frankly also, bringing in Asian democratic allies like Japan, Australia, Taiwan, and working on these issues together, resolving issues related to data privacy and the data transfers, regulating AI, as Vicki talked about, setting standards for emerging technologies, regulating online platforms to counter things like hate speech, disinformation, but then also, investing in R&D and having a industrial strategy that doesn't amount to protectionism, but that really amounts to cooperation amongst like-minded countries. So I think we should be talking less about, digital or technological sovereignty and each side going their own way, and talk more about democratic sovereignty and resilience and competitiveness, because that's ultimately what we need. And that brings me to the second topic, if I may quickly, which is China. Obviously, China, has emerged as one of the key, if not the key topic on the transatlantic agenda, which is very different from only a few years ago. And I think especially in Europe, there has been a strong sense of waking up to the China challenge. Obviously, there's a strong bipartisan consensus in Washington today that China constitutes a systemic challenge. But I think increasingly, even in NATO, there's now an understanding that although China does not constitute a military threat in the same way that Russia does against NATO and its neighbors, China does pose a challenge to the rules-based international order. It poses challenges that has an impact on transatlantic security when it comes to communications, when it comes to alliance interoperability, control of critical infrastructure. I think the debate over Huawei and 5G that we've had in recent years illustrates this, but I think it's only the tip of the iceberg. And I think what the type of conversations we need to have in the coming years is about a wider range of technology stemming from China. I think we're increasingly seeing the Chinese also adopting from the Russian playbook in terms of using online disinformation against European countries and NATO allies. And I think this is a real challenge that NATO needs to be able to tackle, again, alongside the European Union member states. And I do think, there is a sense maybe among some leaders in Europe that, Europe should be careful about aligning too closely with the United States, that, there's US-China competition, and Europe should sort of try to play sort of a middle way between the two great powers. But I think this, and by the way, we've seen some evidence of that, the willingness of Europeans to go ahead with this comprehensive investment agreement with the Chinese, seemingly believing in the notion that you can sort of separate out the economic issues from the broader agenda of issues related to China. But I think increasingly, this strategy seems not very plausible. I think in part because of how China is behaving itself, with the recent sanctions from the Chinese side against European officials, this notion that China is engaging in this wolf warrior diplomacy in Europe, attacking journalists, attacking think tankers. Increasingly public opinion in Europe is turning against China. So I actually think that there is a joint transatlantic approach towards China that is really coming together. And I think the Biden administration here is doing an excellent job in engaging Europeans on China and having the type of conversations, reassuring Europeans that it's not about, as Secretary Blinken said when he was in Brussels recently, it's not about choosing us versus them. It's about defending democracy and addressing China from a common position of strength. So I think there is, a lot more we can do. For instance, when it comes to addressing shared challenges stemming from China, ensuring that we have solidarity between democratic allies when they are being economically coerced or bullied by Beijing, cooperating on FDI screening, restricting technology transfers to China, working on curbing Chinese subsidies and intellectual property theft, but also, frankly, on the human rights piece. And I think here was really significant a couple of weeks ago, where we had joint, not just US-EU sanctions, but also bringing in the Canadians and the Brits in imposing sanctions against China's human rights violations in Xinjiang. This is a great example of what the democratic, transatlantic alliance can do together. But I think it needs to go beyond just the sanctions piece. And I think here the Europeans needs to, really continue developing their strategic thinking about China, being willing to take a firm stand, including on issues like Taiwan, should the situation there become even more complicated. But, at the same time, the US, I think, should engage Europeans constructively, and again, not framing it as an either-or issue, and seeking to work with the European Union. And I think my final point would be, we need to reinvent the transatlantic alliance and recognize that the fundamental fault line is between democracies and authoritarians. We need to think about a collective transatlantic resilience, solidarity, and innovation agenda that ties all these issues together, the technology piece and the democracy issues. And at a time when the United States increasingly becomes oriented around competing with China, especially in the Pacific theater, I do think we need to think about being willing to tolerate a higher degree of whatever you want to call it, European autonomy, or at least the notion that the Europeans need to take a little bit more, responsibility and independence as part of ensuring their own security, both on the eastern flank and the southern flank, so that the U.S. can focus more on issues in the Indo-Pacific, while still making sure that U.S. commitment to NATO remains very firm. And I think we're seeing with the rhetoric from the new Biden team that indeed, U.S. commitment to NATO remains very strong and very firm. So I think there's a lot we can do together, both on the technology piece and on the China piece, and there's a lot of work to do.
Erik, thank you so much for that. I think we may be seeing a tee up to the first challenge on how the U.S. and allies may confront a situation that seems to be escalating with Taiwan. So let me just ask you as a follow-up question for your excellent sort of masterclass in how we should be thinking about cyber aggression in China right now. What do you see happening in Taiwan in the next couple of weeks, given that we've seen so many provocations back and forth, continued U.S. support for Taiwan as it kind of stands against what it sees as Chinese aggression? What could the allies be doing better right now? And then I'd like to follow up your answer by hearing on the same question from General Breedlove.
Sure. Well, thank you for the question. I'm certainly not an expert on Taiwan, so I will refer to others on the panel on that. But I do think, it's symbolically really important. I think, Taiwan is is a democracy. I think we should stand up for Taiwan. And I think it's important that European countries are also willing to do so. And I think we've seen some good examples from the European Parliament inviting Taiwan to participate in various multilateral settings, expressing support for Taiwan. So I think those are the kind of things that Europe can do that's more political and diplomatic to send the right messages. I think Europe's security and military role in the Indo-Pacific is quite limited, despite countries like France and the UK, and increasingly smaller European countries, contributing to security issues in the Indo-Pacific. I think that's really an area where the US still has the critical military assets and will play the key role. I think Europe can make symbolic contributions, again, to things like freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, port of calls with countries like Taiwan and elsewhere. But I think ultimately it's more the political and diplomacy piece where Europe can really make a contribution rather than the security piece when it comes to Taiwan.
Fair enough. General Breedlove, would you agree? If you were still in your SACOR uniform today, how would you be looking at the situation there and an increasing aggression on behalf of China and the situation with Taiwan? I think you might be muted, sir.
There we go.
There we go.
I think I'd like to avoid that direct question. Rather, I think I would like to tie it to some issues that we see in the Chinese may not agree with me, but I happen to believe that people have a sovereign right to follow the path that they choose. And I think that applies in Georgia, where South Ossetia and Abkhazia are occupied. That plays out in Ukraine, where Crimea is occupied and the Donbass is occupied. And these are places where nations should be respected and the wishes of their people should be respected as they approach decisions about where they align themselves, east or west or whatever. And so I think I would tie it back to that and stay on familiar European ground rather than wandering into the Pacific.
I think all of you have expertise that connects the world. So I appreciate that very kind answer. We do have a first audience question. This is from Terry Schultz, and this is for General Breedlove. She says that she will never forget that early Sunday morning in 2014 when you raised an alarm about Ukraine for the first time. So has deterrence failed, she asks, or is this just for Kremlin kicks?
It's good to hear from Terry. And I would challenge her question a little bit by saying, did we ever really have deterrence when it comes to Ukraine? We would have to have had it for it to have failed. But that's sort of a rhetorical question. The fact of the matter is that Mr. Putin has demonstrated that Ukraine means far more to him than it does to the rest of Europe. And so now we have to figure out how to instill or build some amount of deterrence to keep further action from occurring. And the bit about, is this for Kremlin kicks? I think that's a very good question. And I would just restate it is, I've been asked so many times in the last 3 days, what is the motivation for Mr. Putin here? Mm-hmm. And I refer to what I said before. If you find someone who tells you they know what Mr. Putin is thinking, you should exit stage left. But I would offer the following. Clearly, Mr. Putin is not achieving the political successes that he wants with the Zelensky government, and the people of Ukraine continue to seek a Western alignment. And Mr. Putin is going to bring the amount of pressure that he believes he has to try to reorient that thought. I think clearly Mr. Putin was offended by some of the remarks of our new president, and on a world stage that also added to the angst that might engender some of these issues. And then finally, there are the physical things that we talked about before. This could, in fact, be motivated just by the fact that it's becoming intolerable dealing with the water problems in Crimea. There are a lot of issues internal to Russia. It's always good to have an external enemy and an external dust up to focus people out of your internal problems and on external problems. And maybe this is a real military venture. But I do believe that the real beauty of this question is, how do we deter in this new world of hybrid warfare, and how that warfare can quickly turn into kinetic warfare, as it already has twice in Ukraine and may yet in the future.
Very worth watching closely. We have a second audience question from Jack Shelton, who says, thank you all very much for your insights. To what extent will recent Russian actions in the Ukraine, Iranian nuclear activities, and COVID-19 impact alliance structures and signals in the coming years? I'd kind of like to get all of your takes on this quickly, if we can. Vicki, why don't we start with you? You're just on mute.
I'm back, though. I completely lost the connection earlier. I regret that.
You noticed.
So first, I'd just like to say hi, because Jack was one of my students. And I think I should just answer the COVID-19 part of the question, because I think it gives me an opportunity to say how short everyone's memory and attention span is as we watch this devastating public health crisis and pandemic. I mean, and I think we have to be really, really careful. One minute, one country is in the doghouse and looks terrible and incompetent in the way that their government is managing the crisis, and the next they're in the spotlight in a positive way. And so the pandemic is happening in waves. And this came up, in the context of the UK doing so well on their vaccination rollout, and a German politician, criticizing the EU's approach. And I think we see that, I think these governments are earnestly doing the best they can. And what we need to recognize is this is not really it's not a national competition, and it's certainly not an EU versus US who's doing better. This is an opportunity for us to realize exactly how misleading that kind of Europe versus US or others is misleading. I mean, and to reemphasize the notion of this need to focus on the fact that we have internal debate and criticism. We have rich, rigorous scientific debate. And I think it does not serve us very well when some of our leading commentators, and I'm just going to call his name out, Paul Krugman in the New York Times, who wrote a piece criticizing the Europeans' removal of AstraZeneca from the market, and actually used the term, which is a habit of a lot of commentators, describing the Europeans' hostility to science. While the U.S. Food and Drug Administration has not even approved AstraZeneca. And we see what happened with their, removal of Johnson & Johnson. So I think I just want the public to be especially careful with how we're assessing and sizing up other countries and politicians and leaders who are making very, very difficult decisions as we manage this. And also, this has been a collaborative effort. I mean, Pfizer-BioNTech, that is not that's a US and European proposition there. Moderna was a French scientist who, crossed the Atlantic and led Moderna. So I think we need to be very careful about this, nationalism generally that's creeping into the way we're thinking about the management of the COVID crisis.
Vicki, I think that's great feedback, and I'm sure the New York Times would welcome your submission of an op-ed to counter what Mr. Krugman had written, because it's debate worth having. Would either of the rest of you, Suzanne, Erik, or General Breedlove, care to just weigh in on how these issues are impacting alliance structures in the coming years? Or we can move on to another question if not.
I'd just like to quickly make a comment on that. I think much is going to depend on what happens in Vienna over these coming weeks. If we are able to reconstitute this deal, then I do see EU, US working very closely together on next steps. That would be building a longer, stronger deal, to use the Biden administration lingo, extending sunsets, trying to get talks with Iranians started on areas in the region that are undermining both US and European interests. And the Europeans are going to have to play a big role in that, because the Iranians are not going to sit down with US officials anytime soon to discuss those issues. But we also have to ask is what if these Vienna talks fail? So in an absence of a return to compliance by Iran, it seems likely that Iran will continue to increase its own leverage, further expand its nuclear activities, place restrictions on IAEA inspections, and perhaps even ramp up their activities in the region. So this will be another area where the Europeans and US will have to turn their attention to. We have to take into consideration that Iran will likely draw on growing capacity to fight asymmetrical wars with ever better armed proxies. They'll continue to upgrade their ballistic missile systems, their hybrid cyber warfare capabilities. So the deal is an entry point to manage these other issues. So hopefully the former will prevail.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just add a short note on the Ukraine piece. You know, in a larger sense, learned colleagues, I agree. Mr. Putin is focused on two big things. One, discrediting Western democracies, trying to drag them down to his level. And then second, dividing alliances, etc. And I think that what he's doing now in Ukraine is, to his mind, will be succeeding at both of those. Our alliance has those who want to say this is nothing to worry about. Let's just focus on the ceasefire, which has failed, but let's focus on the ceasefire. And then there are others which are taking a more proactive or bellicose look at what this could all turn up. And then inside our democracies, great debates about whether we should be involving ourselves in Ukraine or not. And so I think that Mr. Putin is accomplishing a lot of these larger objectives he has in the actions that he's taken there. And I believe that the longer that we don't be decisive about Ukraine, the more success he'll have.
That's a great point. Question, Erik, for you from Talia Yuzuku, who asks, is there an opportunity for the Transatlantic Alliance to breach sort of this Russia-China alliance we're seeing develop? And in what ways can they cooperate to prevent a stronger alliance between China and Russia?
I think it's a great question. Obviously, we are seeing alignment between Russia and China. It's interesting we're seeing, Russian aggression near Ukraine and sort of Chinese intimidation near Taiwan going on simultaneously. Whether that's coordinated or not, it's hard to know. But certainly there is strategic alignment between Russia and China in terms of they're both authoritarian countries challenging the rules-based order, cooperation on the technology side, the energy side, and so forth. But I think there's also limits, frankly, to the ability for us to characterize the Chinese-Russian relationship as an alliance. I think there are still clear challenges between the two countries. And I think ultimately, I think our strategy should be to not, while we should be mindful of this, not to exaggerate it. And I think my approach would be to, on the one hand, we shouldn't be afraid of keep being firm with Russia because we're afraid that they will fall into the Chinese camp. I think in many ways they're already in that camp, the authoritarian camp. So I think we should maintain a strong posture against Russia on the eastern flank. And as General Breedlove talked about, continue to focus on supporting Ukraine and providing security in the Black Sea. But at the same time, I think we should dispense with the notion that Russia will somehow join the West and that we could bring the Russians in. That's not going to happen. So certainly not under President Putin. So I think our strategy should be not to exaggerate the threat, but at the same time not believing that we could somehow pry them apart or bring the Russians in. We should focus on it as a dual challenge and work on it together as allies.
I can't believe we're almost coming to the end of this conversation. So I'm going to give you all fair warning that we're going to have a little speed dating 90-second closing comment from each of you about looking forward. What's next, right? These conversations are fantastic. It's been incredibly helpful to hear all of this today. But where do we go from here? So let me give you just a moment to think about that while I slip in kind of a last question from our audience that came in via YouTube. And this one's for you, Suzanne. How is Iran getting more advanced centrifuges given that sanctions have been in place for several years? It's a fair question.
So at this stage of Iran's nuclear development, a lot of this is homegrown technology. They do have nuclear scientists, and this is one of the issues of going back into the deal. Iran being outside of compliance has, let's face it, accumulated greater knowledge. They've done more research and development on how to advance their program. So this is an area when they come back into compliance, what do they do with that knowledge? They can't just lose it. So that's a fair question. But on the other hand, the point that they make is that look at the economic gains they lost by having these sanctions reimposed. So I sense that if Vienna doesn't make progress, they will continue to ramp up this program. And that should be priority enough to get back into this deal. Now, what we can see is even though they've ramped up to 60%, it's interesting that they're doing it at above ground facility, which indicates the signaling that, that could easily be bombed. It's not an underground facility. It's a signaling that this is not something they want permanently, in my mind, that they're willing to roll it back. And they know if they get back in the deal, they'll roll it back. I see it more as a bargaining chip.
We'll see a lot of that going on in these conversations in Vienna. Suzanne, thank you for that. Erik, looking forward, what should we be thinking about and what should we be focused on as kind of inflection points when we're thinking about cyber and China?
Sure. Well, I think we need to recognize that I think we're now finally in a pretty good place transatlantically with a new U.S. administration that's done the sort of rebuilding and repairing piece. What I think we need to do is develop some practical policy results over the coming 6 to 12 months. Important summits coming up, G7 this summer. We'll have a NATO summit. We might have a US-EU summit. We'll have Biden's democracy summit in the fall and the COP26 climate summit. So there's a lot that US and Europe needs to do together, both to address the technological issues that I mentioned and the digital piece and making progress, but also on addressing challenges stemming from China. And they're all tied together. But I think what we need to do is making sure that we can translate, better atmospherics and diplomatic ties into actual policy results, because otherwise I think that it's a real missed opportunity. So I really hope that both sides, both Washington and European capitals, can really seize on this moment and deliver some wins that can show that we're making progress on all of these issues at a crucial time.
That would be great. Vicki, where are we headed with AI? What do you see coming up as sort of I don't want to say flashpoints because it's not really the right term, but what do we need to be focused on in terms of making sure that progress is tracking along where it needs to be in terms of the great global competition over AI?
Yeah, well, I think we need to keep our eyes on the prize, and that is this piece of legislation forthcoming in the EU, and hopefully the fact that the EU has already gotten a lot of like-minded democratic partners on board, at least with the voluntary guidelines for ethical AI, and hopefully the Biden administration and the US Congress will be on board as well, because as has been said repeatedly, AI is such a revolutionary and encompassing set of technologies that are going to really define the world in which we live and work, that this is really important. But at the same time, all of these technologies that are changing and actually accentuating some of the vulnerabilities we have as open democratic societies, we need to get our citizens thinking about these technologies and trusting these technologies. And we can only do that if we assure them that we are, monitoring the design and the development and using kind of ethical principles to guide that process. But I also would like to just echo what Erik said and say that we cannot rest on rhetoric, empty rhetoric, by embracing our common values. That story is over. The rubber is hitting the road in a lot of these areas, not just these regional concerns that Suzanne and General Breedlove have highlighted, but also just how we consolidate and strengthen our own societies. It is a competition between democracies and authoritarian or techno-authoritarian regimes, but we are also very vulnerable in that area right now too. So I think we do, and I think Biden is really emphasizing this to kind of shore up our inequalities, and on the EU side as well, focus on jobs and growth and technology that citizens can trust. And that also means reining in big tech power. And there are a lot of like-minded democracies that want to join in that effort as well. So I hope that the EU and the US can cooperate in that area.
Another whole worthy conversation we could be having. General, close us out from the UK. How should we be thinking about, and how will you be thinking about events in the Black Sea region, particularly over the next few months, maybe weeks? Sir, you're also on mute.
There we go again. So it's probably not hard to figure out, having spent a third to 40% of my adult life in Europe, that I am a great believer in our transatlantic relationship and our great alliance, and the importance of embracing partners and others who think like us and have these same values. And so what I would like to focus on, or what I have been talking about, is what I just call Western leadership. My assertion is that for over a decade now, we have been backing away from the leadership table in many places where we should have been more involved. And I believe that that is true of some of our European brothers and sisters as well. And I think that we see some of the consequence of that in our world around us. And I believe that it's important. I'm not trying to say we're better than anybody else, but it is important that Western leaders lead. And I will use an important subset of that. It's important that America be a part of that Western leadership in the world. And I believe that we need to step forward on some of these really tough issues and begin to address them together. And we are stronger together in that respect. And I think that it's really important. So my focus is, let's get back to understanding and being a part of leading through the problems that our world faces.
Well, I'd like to thank all of you, Suzanne DiMaggio, Erik Brattberg, Vicki Birchfield, General Breedlove, for being a part of this conversation. I'd like to thank Senator Nunn and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in their partnership with the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech for hosting this important conversation. Thank you so much, Adam Stolberg. I want to remind everybody to stay tuned for the third installment in this series in the fall, in cooperation with the Sam Nunn and the Bank of America Policy Series. Thank you all so much. I feel like we've had a master class in sort of alliances and their importance on these really critical issues that we're seeing in the world today. All my best to you. Thank you so much. We'll be following all these stories through